Green Willow Hills was the kind of neighborhood people dreamed about. It sat tucked into a bend of tree-covered hills in the northern region of North Carolina, about 20 minutes from the nearest town and wrapped on all sides by a dense curtain of pines, sweet gums, and oaks that filtered golden sunlight through their leaves like stained glass. The roads were clean, lined with neat sidewalks and trimmed hedges. Homes here weren't mansions, but they were well-built, with brick faces, dormer windows, and just enough land to feel private without ever being isolated. But what truly set Green Willow Hills apart, what made it feel alive, was the creek. The creek didn't have a name, at least not officially. Locals called it Green Willow Stream, the Ribbon, or just the creek. It wound gently through the heart of the neighborhood, starting from a spring in the nearby woods and weaving its way between the backyards like a lazy thread of silver. Children splashed in it during the summer, chasing frogs and skipping rocks. Deer visited it at dusk. Crickets and tree frogs serenaded it by night. In spring, it glistened beneath blooming dogwoods. In autumn, it carried the drifting reds and golds of falling leaves. It was not large, not fast, but it was essential. The creek gave the land its rhythm, its voice. David Warner had known this better than most. He had moved to Green Willow Hills nearly 20 years earlier, after retiring early from a 30-year career in civil engineering. He'd designed roads, bridges, water systems. He knew how water moved through land, not just in textbooks, but in the real world with all its unpredictability and nuance. When he bought his home, a modest 2-story brick house that backed right onto the creek, he had felt not only peace but purpose. Watching the water rise and fall, listening to it trickle and rush, seeing how the land responded, it reminded him of how much people misunderstood nature. To David, the creek wasn't just a pleasant feature. It was an intelligent system. It absorbed runoff, slowed erosion, fed soil, and cooled the air. It even regulated insects by supporting natural predators like dragonflies and salamanders. But what struck him most was its quiet efficiency. After every storm, the creek took the surge and carried it gently away. While the rest of the city sometimes flooded, Green Willow Hills stayed dry. It was the land's own defense system. And to David's trained eye, it worked flawlessly until the HOA decided it didn't. The Homeowners Association in Green Willow Hills had always been active, but over the past few years it had grown ambitious. New members came in with big ideas. Young professionals with management backgrounds, tech-savvy retirees, even a former real estate agent who styled herself as Director of Community Aesthetics. Their focus had shifted from mowing lawns and fixing street lamps to something more grand, enhancing curb appeal and maximizing property potential. And somewhere along the line, the creek, this quiet, natural marvel, became a target. At first, the talk was vague. Complaints about mosquitoes. Comments about the creek's muddiness or unpredictable flow. The board floated ideas about tidying the landscape and controlling standing water. Then came surveys. Then studies. Then a meeting. David sat in the back of the clubhouse the night the vote was held. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The board sat at a long table at the front like a tribunal, wearing polo shirts and determined smiles. Mark Harlan, the HOA president, was a burly man with a commanding voice and a habit of speaking in bullet points. He addressed the room with a PowerPoint and a printed handout titled Green Willow Watercourse Improvement Project. "This plan," Mark said, clicking to a slide with a 3D rendering of the neighborhood, "will eliminate mosquito breeding grounds, reduce maintenance costs, and increase property values by creating a clean, modern waterway in place of the current, unmanaged creek system." David raised his hand. "It's not unmanaged," he said. "It's a naturally functioning riparian system. If you try to pour concrete in a stream bed, you'll destroy its drainage capabilities." Mark gave a practiced smile. "Thank you, David. That's noted. However, we've consulted with a contractor. Not a hydrologist, I bet," David muttered. "Who has experience with landscape improvements of this kind?" Mark finished, ignoring him. Another board member chimed in. "Our community survey showed that 65% of residents favor modernization. And no offense, David, but times change. We have to think long-term." David stood then, slowly, feeling the familiar tightness in his knees. "I've been a civil engineer for 3 decades, he said. "You can modernize paths, fences, mailboxes, You do not modernize a watershed. That creek handles runoff during storms. It nourishes native plants. It has a natural filtration role. If you fill it in with concrete, you're not just changing how it looks, you're changing how the entire landscape breathes. Some nodded. Most did not. The vote passed that night. 6-1 in favor of the project. Over the following weeks, the character of the neighborhood began to shift. It started subtly. Surveyors staked markers along the creek. Pink ribbons fluttered from willow branches. Heavy equipment was trucked in and parked in cul-de-sacs like silent animals waiting to pounce. Trees along the creek were trimmed or removed entirely. David, helpless, watched as the first shovels scraped at the banks. The destruction was methodical. First, the vegetation was cleared. Every reed, every sapling, every root that had grown over decades to reinforce the banks. Then the bed was deepened and widened, and the natural contours that helped slow and spread water were carved away. Next came the concrete forms, rigid and sterile. The workers laid them in long sections, bolted and sealed like tiles on a factory floor. By the third week, the stream had been boxed in. By the fourth, water no longer babbled or danced. It slithered, sluggish and sullen, through a sterile chute. The creek was dead. David stood at the edge of his yard one morning in late August and looked at what remained. The sounds were gone. No frogs. No rustling. No play. Just the occasional hollow splash when a squirrel tried to leap over the culvert and missed. The concrete channel was already streaked with sediment. It didn't drain properly. Water pooled in places it never had before. It was, to David's eye, an obvious failure even before the first heavy rains. He wasn't the only one to notice. The kids stopped playing in the creek. Without trees, the sun beat down harder, and the once cool green corridor turned into a sweltering trench. Bugs, ironically, seemed to increase. Without birds and dragonflies, mosquitoes had fewer predators. Standing water in the new channel became a perfect breeding ground. Complaints started trickling in. But no one connected the dots, at least not yet. David tried to move on, but it weighed on him. He spent his mornings journaling what he observed. The new flow patterns, the erosion beginning at the downstream end, the cracks forming at the concrete seams. He sent emails. He offered reports. He even drew models of what would happen in a heavy storm. The board ignored him. One day in early September, he got a call from a neighbor, Ana Ruiz, a young woman who had moved in with her husband 2 years earlier. She had a toddler and was worried about mold after noticing strange damp patches in her crawlspace. "You don't think it's because of the creek thing, do you?" she asked. David paused. "I think it's the beginning of something worse." She was the first of many to ask that same question. Rain came that week. Not a flood, just a steady, soaking rain. But the new channel struggled. The water rose quickly, overflowed, and backed into yards. Soil, now unanchored by roots, washed away. The water didn't move like it once had. Pooled, pushed sideways, and crept into basements. For the first time in the neighborhood's history, residents started using sump pumps. Still, the board insisted it was seasonal excess. But David knew. The balance had been broken. The living system had been replaced by a rigid, lifeless one that couldn't adapt. And worse, the real storms hadn't even begun. For a brief moment, the newly poured concrete channel through Green Willow Hills shimmered under the September sun like a modern marvel. The HOA praised it in the community newsletter as a revitalization success, boasting of reduced maintenance costs, lower risk of pests, and the enhanced visual appeal of a uniform watercourse. Pictures of the pristine gray culvert, newly painted benches near its banks, and smiling board members accompanied the write-up. Some homeowners nodded along with satisfaction, proud that their dues had gone toward progress. They took morning walks along the channel, oblivious to the silence that now haunted the corridor where birds once sang and frogs once croaked. Others, particularly the older residents who had seen the neighborhood evolve over decades, eyed the change warily. They may not have had David Warner's background in civil engineering, but they knew something was off. The creek had stopped singing, and nature, in its silence, was holding its breath. David Warner watched it all unfold from his back porch, his gray eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. He kept meticulous notes every morning, measuring water flow, sketching erosion patterns, cataloging plant loss. With each observation, his apprehension grew. The cement channel was not just unnatural, it was unstable. During a dry week, the surface water would pool in low spots where the concrete hadn't been graded correctly. Insects congregated in these stagnant pools which no longer flushed out with the rhythmic pulse of a living stream. Mosquitoes buzzed thick in the air. Without the dragonflies, frogs, and fish that had once kept them in check, their numbers exploded. Ironically, the very pest control project the HOA championed had birthed a public health issue. David tried, again, to warn the board. He wrote a series of detailed emails with accompanying photographs, charts, and annotated topographic overlays showing how the new design inhibited drainage and encouraged backflow. He pointed out that the slope of the concrete was insufficient in several segments, creating slow-moving sections that encouraged sediment buildup. He warned that even moderate rainfall would lead to backups and heavier storms could cause significant flooding. His final line was dire: "This isn't a question of if, it's when." But the only response he received was a short message from the HOA secretary thanking him for his feedback and assuring him that all concerns are being reviewed with great care. Nothing changed. September 14th began like any other muggy North Carolina day, with thick humidity blanketing the yards and the scent of wet grass hanging heavy in the air. But the barometer had been dropping steadily, and by mid-afternoon the sky had turned the color of tarnished pewter. The weather station issued a flash flood advisory warning of a stalled system that could drop inches of rain overnight. David checked his weather instruments and quietly moved his most important belongings from the basement to the ground floor. He didn't panic. He prepared for this. He had no illusions about the channel's ability to cope. But he also knew his property. His was one of the few built on a natural rise. The creek had always protected it, carrying water downhill and away. Now that balance was broken. The rain began around 6:15 p.m., slow at first, a soft drizzle tapping against window panes. Then it grew stronger, sheets of water slapping the roofs, turning driveways into rivulets. By 8:30 p.m., thunder growled across the hills and wind lashed trees back and forth. The power flickered, then failed entirely. Without electricity, some pumps shut down, porch lights blinked out, and all that remained was the relentless roar of water. At 9:12 p.m., David stepped outside with a flashlight and walked to the edge of the channel. The beam illuminated swirling water that had already reached the top edge of the concrete embankment. He could see debris, sticks, leaves, trash caught in one section where two slabs didn't align perfectly, creating a makeshift dam. Behind it, the water rose fast. He shined the light farther downstream and saw more of the same, clogs where the flow should have sped up, now transformed into churning whirlpools. What had once been a self-cleansing system of natural bends and barriers was now a rigid, dysfunctional bottleneck. At 9:36 p.m., the first yard flooded. It belonged to the Varnas, a couple in their 60s who lived 2 houses down. David saw the water creeping across their garden like a slow wave, pushing mulch up over the edge of the retaining wall and pooling under their back deck. Their basement light flickered briefly before going dark. He grabbed his phone and tried calling them, but the call didn't go through. The cell towers were likely overloaded or out. He made a mental note to check on them at first light. By 10:15 p.m., it wasn't just the Varnas. The Thompsons' pool had overflowed. The McMillans' shed floated 10 feet across their yard. Water poured through basement windows. One family, the Clarks, had moved into their home only 3 months earlier. Their daughter, maybe 5 years old, was seen crying at the window while her father frantically bailed water with a kitchen pot. David, helpless to intervene in the storm's fury, could only watch as neighbor after neighbor fell victim to a disaster that had been manufactured by the very people meant to protect them. Irony struck hardest at 11:02 p.m., when David saw headlights beam across the flooded street. Mark Harlan's car. The HOA president had apparently driven back from a dinner function, unaware of how bad things had gotten. His driveway had turned into a lagoon. The moment he opened his car door, water rushed in. He tried to reach his porch but slipped, wading knee-deep through brown water that sloshed over the top of his shoes and soaked the hem of his pants. From David's porch, the sight felt almost surreal. The man who'd fought so hard to concrete over nature was now being swallowed by it. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the neighborhood lay still, as if dazed. The sun peeked through broken clouds and cast a soft light on what could only be described as chaos. Lawns were shredded. Garden beds were islands. Driveways had turned into muddy, pocked trenches. Silt-blanketed porches. Everything smelled of wet earth, mildew, and diesel from generators humming in the distance. And everywhere, stood the water. David pulled on his boots and began checking on neighbors. The Varna's basement was fully submerged. He helped them move furniture to higher ground. The Clarks had lost their furnace. Anna Ruiz's crawlspace had collapsed partially. The support beams soaked and warped. He made notes of each case, photographing damage, calculating water height from tide lines on the siding. In total, at least 11 homes had suffered serious flooding, 5 had structural water damage, and 2 were still inaccessible due to standing water in their yards. All of them were located along the former path of the creek. Later that afternoon, the local news van arrived. A young reporter in rain boots stood near the concrete channel and gestured broadly as she spoke into the camera. Behind her, David watched silently as Mark Harlan tried to explain what had happened. He used words like unprecedented rainfall, extraordinary circumstances, and unexpected challenges. But David knew there was nothing unprecedented about this. The creek would have handled this storm just fine. It had for decades. What was unprecedented was the arrogance that led people to believe they could silence nature and not face consequences. That evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting hastily assembled at the community clubhouse. Residents packed the room, some still in wet clothes, others in rubber boots. Tension crackled like static. Mark Harlan stood at the front again, but this time his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We understand that many of you experienced hardship due to last night's storm," he began. "Please know that the board is taking this seriously." A man in the back shouted, "My basement is gone. And you're telling me it's the weather's fault?" A woman held up her phone with a photo of her submerged laundry room. "You said this new system would improve drainage." Mark adjusted his collar. "We were told by professionals that this would be a sustainable solution." They weren't professionals, someone else yelled. They were landscapers. The room erupted into chaos. Voices layered over voices, questions slammed over accusations. And then David stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence commanded the room with quiet gravity. "I told you this would happen," he said simply. "I wrote reports. I gave warnings. You can't replace a natural watershed with concrete and expect the land to function the same way. That creek did more than carry water, it regulated it. You removed every feedback loop it had. No absorption. No filtration. No dissipation. Just a chute. And now you're all surprised the water went where it wasn't supposed to go." There was silence, broken only by the soft hum of the emergency lights above. Mark started to reply, but David held up a hand. "I'm not here to gloat," he said. "I'm here to help. We can fix this. But it starts by admitting the mistake." That night, no formal decisions were made, but the mood had shifted. The board was shaken. The community, once passive and trusting, had awoken. And David, once dismissed as an eccentric old engineer clinging to the past, had become something else, a witness, a voice, maybe even a leader. The rains had come. The consequences had followed. And the creek, silenced but not forgotten, had made its absence known. Morning came to Green Willow Hills like a fragile ceasefire after a brutal skirmish. The sun rose not with triumphant rays but with a weary, uncertain glow that glinted off flood-slicked sidewalks and scattered debris. Water still lingered in the low yards like forgotten battleships after war, marooned and slowly rotting in the morning heat. The air reeked of mildew and the kind of damp rot that settled deep into drywall and subfloors, the kind no insurance adjuster could fully price in. Inside homes across the neighborhood, carpet had already begun to bubble. Baseboards peeled like scorched paper. And in the homes of many, the true storm, the one of blame, bureaucracy, and broken promises, was just beginning. Mark Harlan sat at his dining room table, hair uncombed, eyes hollow. His once pristine suit jacket was slung across a chair, crusted with dried mud. The HOA president, normally a man of routine and polish, now looked like he'd been up for 48 hours straight. In truth, he had. His phone had not stopped buzzing since the flood. Calls from angry residents. Voicemails from confused board members. Texts from local reporters. The community email account was now a graveyard of fury and legal threats. What had started as a beautification project had spiraled into the kind of fiasco that shredded reputations and bank accounts. Across town, David Warner was busy setting up a whiteboard in his garage. What had once served as his modest workshop had quickly become a staging area for concerned neighbors. Fold-out chairs lined the walls. A few stacks of waterproofed municipal records and engineering maps leaned precariously near the workbench. On the whiteboard, he'd scrawled in thick marker, causes, consequences, corrections. Beneath it, bullet points in precise handwriting summarized key facts. Improper slope, impermeable surfaces, increased flow velocity, sediment displacement. He'd already had 2 reporters visit him that morning, including one from the Raleigh Gazette. David had never wanted to be a public figure, but he couldn't walk away from this now. "I told them it would flood," he said in the latest interview. "This was textbook. You replace a meandering, vegetated stream with a concrete sluice, you get surface runoff, not absorption. It's hydrology 101. You turned a sponge into a mirror." The quote went viral. Within hours, Green Willow Hills was the subject of evening news specials and viral social media posts. Footage of submerged basements played side by side with the HOA's glossy promotional photos of the finished concrete channel. The irony was too thick for the public to ignore. Here was a wealthy suburban neighborhood that had attempted to sterilize nature, and ended up drowning in its rejection. News headlines pounced. When HOA hubris meets Mother Nature. The creek they buried came back for revenge. Concrete mistake. A suburban water tragedy. Inside the HOA's temporary crisis office, formerly the clubhouse game room, the remaining board members convened for what could charitably be called a damage control meeting. Mark Harlan opened the session with a shaky voice. "We have a narrative problem," he began, adjusting his tie even though no one was recording. "People are misinterpreting what happened here." Marta Ellis, the HOA secretary, snorted. She was in her early 50s, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had spent the last 2 days fielding over 70 emails from furious homeowners. "Misinterpreting?" she asked. "Mark, half the neighborhood flooded. You said this would fix drainage, not create a new floodplain." Mark stiffened. "We followed professional advice. From a landscaping company," Marta shot back. "Not a civil engineer. Not even a hydrologist. They specialize in koi ponds and backyard patios. You gave them a stormwater project. They came highly recommended. No one can find them now, Mark." That was true. The contractor, a small outfit calling itself Waterscape Innovations, had apparently closed up shop overnight. Their website was down. Their phone number went straight to voicemail. Their last listed address turned out to be a UPS store P.O. box in Durham. It was becoming increasingly clear the company had no licensure to perform structural waterway redesigns, nor the insurance to back their work. Lawsuits were imminent. Still, Mark tried to hold the line. "Let's focus on solutions. We can bring in a real engineering firm now. Assess the situation. Make recommendations. Maybe even secure a FEMA grant or state disaster aid. That'll help with repairs." Marta folded her arms. "We're not getting FEMA money for a mistake we made ourselves. You buried a functioning creek." Around the room, the other board members murmured their assent. No one wanted to be the one left holding the bag. Mark sighed, pressing 2 fingers to his temple. "Okay. Then we release a statement. Acknowledge the damage. Emphasize that we were trying to improve the neighborhood. Shift the focus to climate change, increased rainfall patterns, storm intensity. You want to blame the weather? We blame conditions beyond our control. But we caused those conditions." The meeting ended with no resolution. And in the parking lot afterward, 2 board members quit outright. "I didn't sign up for litigation," one muttered. "This whole thing is a time bomb." Back on Willowbend Court, residents began organizing. Not through the HOA, but against it. They started with a petition demanding an independent third-party assessment of the concrete channel. Within 2 days, 68% of the homeowners had signed. The petition also called for a full audit of HOA finances, citing misuse of dues for unlicensed construction and negligent public works decisions. A vote of no confidence was scheduled for the next General Assembly. Mark Harlan was officially on borrowed time. Meanwhile, David's garage meetings had evolved into action groups. Younger residents who'd previously ignored HOA affairs now found themselves immersed in stormwater management reports and GIS maps. Parents brought their kids, who helped hand out leaflets titled "Know Your Watershed." Local college students offered to help with soil samples and drone footage of the flood's path. David had become something of a neighborhood sage, but he didn't relish the attention. "This isn't about proving anyone wrong," he told them. "It's about protecting where we live. We either work with nature or nature works us over." The insurance fallout came next. Homeowners across Green Willow Hills began filing claims for water damage, ruined furniture, foundation shifts, and mold remediation. The response from insurers was nearly identical in every case: denial. The flood, they claimed, was not an act of God, but the result of human intervention, namely the HOA's alteration of the creek system. In other words, it was a man-made disaster. And man-made disasters weren't covered under their standard homeowner policies. Frantic calls to lawyers followed. Legal fees piled up. Some residents, too devastated to fight, took out second mortgages. Others moved in with relatives, abandoning their soaked homes while contractors added their names to 6-week-long wait lists. Mold crept in under crown molding and behind insulation. Musty air triggered asthma attacks. One family had to send their child to stay with grandparents out of state after repeated hospital visits. And still, the mosquitoes came. Where once dragonflies and frogs had patrolled the creek's marshy borders, now stagnant pools collected between uneven slabs of concrete, left behind by the imperfect pour of waterscape innovations. These shallow puddles were warm, protected, and undisturbed, perfect breeding grounds. Within 2 weeks of the flood, biting insects swarmed the neighborhood. Residents installed mosquito nets over beds. Some sprayed their yards with repellents, while others lit smoky citronella torches like they were preparing for siege warfare. Children couldn't play outside. Dogs came in scratching and red-eyed. And still, Mark Harlan sent out emails. "We are working with pest control companies," he wrote. No one believed him anymore. The final blow came when a state environmental inspector arrived unannounced. He walked the length of the concrete channel, took water samples, scraped sediment from joints between the slabs, and asked sharp questions of whoever approached. Days later, a letter arrived addressed to the HOA board. It contained a cease and desist order. The modification of a natural watercourse had violated 3 state environmental protection statutes. The project lacked proper permits. No impact assessment had been filed. The HOA was now subject to potential fines and an enforcement action requiring partial or full removal of the concrete. Mark Harlan held one final press conference, if it could be called that. Standing in front of a backdrop of wilting hedges and sandbagged doorways, he read from a trembling sheet of paper. "We did what we thought was best," he said. "We had the neighborhood's interests at heart. We were misled by contractors and were unaware of the permitting requirements. We now recognize that more diligence was needed." He paused, then added, "This was a democratic decision." Those words did him in. By framing the disaster as something the community chose together, he tried to spread the blame. But the neighborhood knew better. The HOA board, under his leadership, had overridden environmental concerns, fast-tracked the project, and dismissed opposition. It hadn't been democratic. It had been performative. When the vote of no confidence came the following week, it was unanimous. Mark was removed. 3 board members resigned immediately. A special election was scheduled, and David Warner, once a quiet, retired engineer living at the edge of the old creek, was asked by over a dozen residents to run. He declined. "I'm not a politician," he said. "But I'll help. I'll advise. What we need now isn't someone to sit behind a desk. We need people out in the dirt, fixing things, understanding the land. We have to listen to the land again." And so a committee was formed. Not an HOA board, not yet. Just a group of residents, engineers, students, and parents. Their task: begin undoing the mistake. It would be expensive. It would take months, even years. But the first signs of hope emerged not from cement or meetings, but from the earth itself. Where the concrete had cracked, grass poked through. A frog returned to one stagnant pool. Dragonflies hovered near the old creek bend that still, faintly, curved through David's backyard. Nature had not given up. Neither had they. By the time the first town hall was called, Green Willow Hills had become more than just a neighborhood, it was a case study. Local universities cited it in environmental design courses. Urban planning blogs dissected it. Engineers used it as a cautionary tale during lunch and learn lectures. The name had become synonymous with what could happen when image took precedence over infrastructure. When control was favored over coexistence. But the people who still lived there weren't just a footnote in someone else's lecture. They were the ones wading through the aftermath, rebuilding, rethinking, and most importantly, listening. That town hall wasn't held in the fancy HOA clubhouse. The carpets were still mildewed, and no one wanted to sit in a room where the decisions had been made to bury their creek. Instead, they gathered on folding chairs in the gymnasium of the nearby elementary school. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled faintly of bleach and linoleum, and children's artwork lined the cinder block walls. In the front row sat David Warner, his canvas jacket folded neatly on his lap, a binder of notes beside him. To his left was Marta Ellis, now something of a whistleblower turned ally. Behind them were rows of residents, the recently displaced, the mold-weary, the disillusioned, and those who had found purpose in the struggle. There were no microphones, no professional moderators. Just a whiteboard, a hand-printed agenda, and a room full of people who had finally started to understand the cost of ignoring the land beneath their feet. David stood first. "I don't think I need to tell anyone here what went wrong," he began. "You lived it. You cleaned it out of your basements. You watched your kids get eaten alive by mosquitoes. You paid the repair bills. So I'll start by asking something different. What would we do differently if we could go back?" Silence fell. Then a man in the back raised his hand. "I'd speak up sooner." A woman across the aisle nodded. "I'd ask more questions. I trusted the board because I didn't want to deal with it." Another said, "I would have walked down to that creek myself. Seen what we were about to lose." One by one, voices emerged, regretful, reflective, resolute. What had started as a room filled with blame slowly shifted into one filled with resolve. The question shifted from what went wrong to how they could make it right. That night, the community voted overwhelmingly to remove the concrete channel. It would be a monumental task. The costs would be steep. But for the first time in over a year, the direction was clear. The process began the very next week. A formal restoration committee was created, composed not of HOA board members, but of engineers, residents, environmental volunteers, and yes, David Warner. He had initially declined to lead, but when the group insisted, he agreed on one condition: we stop treating nature like a nuisance. It's the best infrastructure we have. To start, the committee contacted the state's Department of Environmental Quality and requested assistance in crafting a formal stream restoration plan. They also brought in 2 wetland ecologists from the university, both of whom lit up with interest when they heard the story. "You've got a rare opportunity," one said. "Most communities don't get a second chance after this kind of damage. Your soil is still viable. Your water table's still high. You haven't lost everything, not yet." Surveys were conducted. Soil samples were taken. Drone footage mapped every inch of the concrete channel. The worst portions, where the water had undercut the slabs or stagnated, were flagged for immediate removal. Volunteers showed up in work gloves and boots, carrying shovels, crowbars, and wheelbarrows. Teenagers hauled rebar under adult supervision. Elderly neighbors brought lemonade and sandwiches. The neighborhood had once prided itself on its quiet, manicured lawns. Now it was buzzing with the noise of renewal. The concrete didn't come out all at once. Piece by piece, section by section, it was broken down. The initial plan called for full removal, but early tests showed that the underlying creek bed had been deeply compacted and partially sealed. Restoration would take more than just ripping up pavement. They had to reintroduce meanders, rebuild embankments, and replant native vegetation that could stabilize soil and absorb floodwaters. With the help of university interns and grant money from the state's Water Resources Fund, they began resculpting the creek. Logs were anchored along new bends to slow flow. Deep pools were carved out to encourage wildlife to return. Young willows, river birch, and swamp milkweed were planted along the banks. Instead of railings and cement walls, they added permeable stone paths, educational signs, and benches made from reclaimed wood. Months passed. Summer turned to fall. Leaves fell into the water again, decomposing into the sediment that had once nourished the stream's microecosystems. Frogs returned, first one, then dozens. Dragonflies hovered over the pools by late September. By October, neighbors began spotting herons. The homes that had flooded were in various states of recovery. Some remained empty, their owners having cut losses and moved away. But others were being repaired with newfound resilience, basements sealed, sump pumps upgraded, yards reshaped to redirect flow. Insurance companies, facing mounting pressure from media and a potential class action, began reopening claims, especially once evidence mounted that the HOA had acted without required permits. Marta Ellis, once the secretary who had quietly gone along with everything, now led homeowner advocacy efforts. She organized a coalition that pushed for policy changes at the county level, mandatory environmental reviews for all HOA-led projects, more oversight on suburban development, and clearer permitting rules for stormwater alteration. Her efforts made her a minor local hero. One rainy night, David sat on his back porch listening to the water flow again behind his home. Not through concrete, but through earth and reeds. The sound was different than it had been before the disaster, but it was alive. Organic. Comforting. He sipped coffee and pulled a blanket tighter around his shoulders as lightning flickered in the distance. Rain came down steady, then stronger. The wind blew in bursts. For a moment he worried, would the creek hold? Had they really fixed it? He walked down the path with a flashlight, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The creek had widened naturally where the bend had been restored. Water rushed through, carried around the bend, and emptied into the broader marsh at the bottom of the slope. No flooding. No pooling. Just flow, uninterrupted, balanced. As the rain picked up, David saw something he hadn't expected. 2 neighborhood kids waiting near the edge of the creek, boots on, umbrellas tossed aside, splashing in the mud with delighted shrieks. He grinned. "Careful now," he called out. They waved back, then ran off, leaving prints in the damp earth. The creek was no longer a danger. It was a part of the neighborhood again, this time respected. By spring, the transformation was undeniable. Wildflowers bloomed along the edges. Birds nested in the newly grown thickets. The concrete rubble had been repurposed into a retaining wall further downstream, now covered in moss. Walking tours were organized for nearby neighborhoods, and the restoration project was written up in 2 major publications, American River Journal and the Suburban Ecologist. The new HOA board, now called the Green Willow Watershed Committee, no longer focused on aesthetic uniformity. Their agenda revolved around ecosystem health, community education, and storm resilience. Meetings began with updates on rainfall totals and soil moisture. Kids drew posters about rain gardens and water is a friend, not a flood. Nature, once treated like a problem to be contained, had become the community's greatest ally. At a celebration event that June, complete with food trucks and a small creekside concert, David was given a plaque that read, "For listening when others paved over the truth." He accepted it humbly. "I didn't do this alone," he said. "This wasn't about one guy fighting an HOA. This was about waking up. About understanding that we're part of something bigger than zoning regulations and concrete channels. The land remembers. And if we respect it, it gives back. Not every home was saved. Not every neighbor came back. But those who remained had something more valuable than symmetry and smooth sidewalks. They had a shared history of loss and of hard-won restoration. By the time the next major storm came, the creek held. It swelled, yes. It rose fast. But then it subsided. The banks held firm. The water filtered through reeds and gravel, pooled in floodplains, and rejoined its natural rhythm. No sandbags were needed. And as the storm passed and the clouds cleared, sunlight returned to Green Willow Hills, not with ironic cruelty, but with the quiet dignity of a land finally allowed to breathe. Because in the end, despite all that had been tried, all that had been poured and paved, one truth had resurfaced, clearer than ever. You can't pave over nature and expect it not to fight back.